Hello and good morning to you. We're so grateful for this beautiful day. It is a new day. It's a new week, the first day of that week, and it's October 1st, so it's a new month. And we're grateful that we get to see the newness of God each and every day, but especially reminded of that on this day, and that we get to give Him thanks and praise for all good things. Don mentioned Exposure Youth Camp. Let's make a special plea. We try to remind you of this a year in advance every time, but now let's ask for your commitment directly. That's December 27th through 30th, as it is always, up in Huntsville, Alabama. That's for 6th grades and up. And that is $70 person fee, but the church, the elders are willing to pay the majority of the fee that we pay to Exposure, and we're grateful for their support in that endeavor. And the deadline is going to be October 18th, so be deciding and making those decisions soon, and get with me if you have questions, and I'll send some more out to you directly the next couple of days. Also, just a reminder about our daily Bible reading. I try to put that in the bulletin every week. And this day begins the New Testament. So if you've been keeping up, you'll notice that yesterday finished out the Old Testament. Today begins the New Testament with Luke chapter 1 and John chapter 1. That is an orange sheet out in the foyer, an orange folded sheet. And so whether or not you've read through the Old Testament, today is the perfect day for you to begin. You can take the last quarter of this year, these final 3 months, and read through the entire New Testament. I would encourage you to do that, and it's neat to be able to read the Gospels in chronological order, and that'll help us to grow closer to our Lord and to be more familiar with His will. So I'd encourage you to do that if you have not, or if you are. Thank you for doing it. We're grateful for your commitment, and know that you'll be blessed by that commitment. Psalm 89. Psalm number 89 is where we'll be. If you want to turn in your Old Testaments to that psalm, we'll get there shortly. Psalm number 89. When God inflicted the plagues upon the Egyptians, He systematically showed the Egyptians and the Israelites both that the system of gods that they had concocted were not real. They were false. And so plague after plague after plague proves the gods are powerless. The final plague, of course, was the most devastating, as He killed the firstborn son of every Egyptian household. The plague prior to that one, the 9th plague, went after the chief Egyptian god. Ra was their chief god, the sun god. So the 9th plague was complete darkness. For God to show the Egyptians that their gods were completely powerless and that He was in control, He darkened the sun, completely incapacitated them, the brink of ruin, by taking out the sun. Many centuries later, in the country of France, you have one of the longest serving kings, King Louis XIV, served for 72 years, consolidated the French kingdom, did a lot of great things, a lot of wars that he was victorious in. In that reign of 72 years, he chose the sun as his symbol. He was known as the Sun King. And it's said that one of the reasons that he chose the sun is because it is the star which gives life to all things. That it rises and it sets with unfailing regularity. Every civilization has understood the necessity of the sun to daily life. It's far more than light. It gives us light, which is important, but it also sends energy into our world. It's a constant burning of energy. And we feel that energy in terms of heat. And the temperature rises and falls based on the amount of energy that we're receiving at any given time. Now, although we perceive the sun as changing, it does such a great job as God designed it to do because it is constant in its burning. When it appears to change, it's actually staying the same, and we're changing relative to it. When it sets at night, it's the same as it's always been, but we have rotated away from it. When it rises in the morning, it's the same as it's always been, but we've now turned back toward it. When the seasons change, as we're undergoing right now, they're changing because we're moving away from it in distance. It's the same all along. It is such a life-giving force because it is absolutely fixed in its position and its qualities. The further we get away from the sun, the less we experience its energy. The closer we are to the sun, the more we receive its energy. As we move into the discussion for the month of October about the fruit of the Spirit, faithfulness, and we start with the faithfulness of God, we remember the same is true of God, that God does not change, and therefore He can be counted on always. And that the farther away we get from God, the less we experience His faithfulness, and thus the less we grow. The closer we get to God, the more we do experience His faithfulness, and thus grow in His sight, in our own faithfulness. We're going to do our best to survey this psalm, Psalm number 89, but we're especially going to dive into one section where the psalmist shows this transfer, as it were, of God's faithfulness and how it's seen in our lives and our faithfulness. Let's open, though, Psalm number 89, beginning verse number 1 to introduce the psalm. Verse number 1, I will sing of the steadfast love of the Lord forever. With my mouth I will make known your faithfulness to all generations. For I said, steadfast love will be built up forever in the heavens. You will establish your faithfulness. You have said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David, my servant. I will establish your offspring forever and build your throne for all generations. We can look at the first 4 verses and see much of what we need to know for the rest of the psalm. Notice verse number 1, he says, I will sing. You also get the end of verse number 1, with my mouth I will make known your faithfulness. But notice in that first clause of verse number 1, I will sing of the steadfast love of the Lord. That's a good and right translation to translate that term steadfast love. But it is a little different from how that term is usually used, because here it's in the plural. So you might find some translations say, I will sing of the mercies, plural, of the Lord forever. Now what that does is it brings to mind that His mercies are tangible. They're observable. It's not just an abstract thing. There are things we can look at and that we can list. And when we begin to do that, we find that they are limitless. They're tangible things we can look and say, well, God is merciful and good to us and faithful. And then the more we make that list, the more we find it's limitless. We also see 3 key words in these first 4 verses that help us to get throughout the entire psalm. We see faithfulness and forever both mentioned in the first 2 verses, and they're each mentioned 9 times in the entire psalm. So 52 verses, each mentioned 9 times. The faithfulness of God lasting forever is a main emphasis for the psalmist here. And that's done through the lens of this 3rd key word, you find it in verse 3, about the covenant. You have said, I made a covenant with my chosen one. Now it's important to notice that because it's the covenant of David, what we call the Davidic covenant from 2 Samuel chapter 7. That's the covenant he's referencing in this psalm. It's the covenant, the part of the covenant that Tyler read for us in our scripture reading a moment ago. When he quotes verses 3 and 4, he's quoting from 2 Samuel chapter 7 directly. And he says, you have said. He's quoting the very words of God to be able to say, here's how I know you're faithful because you have said, and then he's going to be able to show, here's all that you have done to keep what you have said. So not only do we remind ourselves that God speaks and that makes Him good and faithful, but He speaks in covenants, agreements with mankind. He has spoken a covenant, and the psalmist says, when I praise you, when I list aspects of your faithfulness, I go back to the covenant you made with David to bless his family. He's going to do that again at the end of the psalm, which is even more insightful because the end of the psalm is pretty difficult emotionally. But he says, you have sworn, in verse number 49. So notice he's bookending the psalm, verse number 3, with what you have said, and at the end, verse 49, you have sworn. As he prays and as he wrestles with some difficult things that are happening, he is able to lean on specifically what God has spoken. They are his foundation. So a quick outline, we're not going to break the book down or the psalm down completely, but he talks about God's faithfulness as seen in heaven, how it's praised in heaven amongst the angels. And then you begin to see the faithfulness of God in the next section and how it's seen on earth. And then the section we'll discuss is verses 14 through 18. How is the faithfulness of God then seen in the lives of his people. God is faithful, therefore we trust him, and you see that in our faithfulness. The next two sections become important for interpreting the latter part of the psalm, the latter quarter. 19 through 29 talks about that covenant he made with David to continue his family lineage forever. That's the word, forever. And then verses 30 through 37 emphasize how the covenant came with the recognition that they would suffer if they left their part, if they forsook their part of the covenant. So just hold on to those aspects. It's important to see it in terms of the overall context of the psalm. But we're going to dive into verse number 14 now here for our main emphasis this morning. Let's read beginning 14. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. He's talking about King David, covenant made to David to preserve his lineage, his dynasty forever. But he first goes to the throne of God, God's reign. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. Blessed are the people who know the festal shout, the celebratory shouting, who walk, O Lord, in the light of your face, who exult in your name all the day, and in your righteousness are exalted. For you are the glory of their strength. By your favor our horn is exalted. For our shield belongs to the Lord, our King, to the Holy One of Israel. So after setting up the faithfulness of God in the previous sections, here he shows this transfer. Look at how righteous and just and faithful God is, verses 14 and 15, and then how you see that in verses 17 and 18. What the psalmist is going to do here is to use the qualities and characteristics of God, all the attributes of God and how they build together to prove his constant desire and his constant compassion upon us that we then notice as his faithfulness, how he keeps his word, how he keeps his promises always. So as we look at some of the attributes that he's going to list beginning in 14, call to mind again verse 1, plural mercies, plural acts of steadfast love, or aspects of steadfast love. That's what he's going to do here beginning in verse number 14. So first, notice the things that are said about God. His throne is that of righteousness and justice. 1 Kings chapter 19 and verse 20 depicts Solomon's throne, and it shows that his throne was built on a foundation of lions, carved out and beautiful. When God sits on his throne, what's the foundation of his throne? What lifts up God's throne? It's the qualities of righteousness and justice. There are things that are good and pure and right objectively. And all of those things come from God because God is righteous. But then there's also justice. That's how goodness is often seen in action among people. There are things that are just or truly fair or impartial. God's always ruling with what's good and pure, and he's always ruling in a way that's impartial. That's the foundation for how he rules and how he treats us. But then he mentions the term faithfulness again here. That reminds us of God's truthfulness and his trustworthiness. When he speaks, he keeps it. When he speaks, he doesn't change his mind. When he speaks, he doesn't hide it. He speaks and he keeps it. So when we ask what's truthful, what's trustworthy, we're always asking, what is it that God approves? What is it that God has said? And then finally, he closes with chesed, that word for steadfast love or mercies. It's always what's in our best interest. So faithfulness and steadfast love go before him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation for his throne. When we trust that these qualities are in him and are in him fully, and we seek him for them, that is when we are, quote, as the text says, walking in the light of his face. We have turned to him, and we keep turning toward him. That's verse 15, the end of that verse. Who walk, O Lord, in the light of your face. That's turning toward the sun, getting nearer the sun to absorb the righteousness, the justice, the faithfulness, the steadfast love. There's nothing that turns our orientation overall. There's nothing that turns our eyes away from Him. The more we are turned toward Him, and the more we walk closer with Him, the more we then receive and experience His faithfulness. But then beginning in verse number 17, we see how this results. So 15 and 16 are the process of us keeping turned toward Him, and now verses 17 and 18, here's how that's seen in the lives of those who follow Him. We see that His glory is in our strength. You are the glory of their strength. By your favor, our horn is exalted. Horn is, obviously, when we think of animals that are strong and have horns, horns represent their size, their strength, their might, and their power. To lift up the horn is to show that the animal is strong and is intimidating. Well, likewise, the author is saying is as if we have horns, and God, you are lifting our heads up, therefore our horns are lifted up and exalted. The first part of the verse, you are the glory of their strength. Any credit, any attention upon our lives is ultimately shifted toward God. There's strength that we live with if we're living faithfully. There's endurance, there's perseverance that's necessary. And think about how often we rightly say that when someone lives through moments of temptation, uncertainty, and testing, we rightly say they have a strong faith. Well, here, you're the glory of their strength. Those who return to you, you're the one who gets the credit, and you're the one who gets the credit for helping them to endure. You are the reason they are strong. I think you'll notice verse number 17, by your favor, our horn is exalted. Not only is there strength that comes from God, but there's God's good choosing of His people. God shows His favor and His blessing upon His people. He's good to us because He is good. It comes from His good nature. And He has the desire to show that goodness. That's favor. And then finally, verse number 18, our shield belongs to the Lord. He is our protection. He protects, He preserves. Now think about how important this concept is, especially in light of how he closes verse 18, our King to the Holy One of Israel. This is a psalm that anchors its language in the covenant made to David the king, but first recognizes God is the true king, and He's the true shield. That their protection doesn't come from a mere earthly king, but from God, who is the shield and who is the ultimate king. As we think about these concepts, that God is faithful, and He's faithful to us, and that we then see this in our lives in the form of fruitfulness, I think we would do well to remind ourselves of what we just said from the text and see it in the lives of people who are said to have been faithful. So Hebrews chapter 11, for instance, verse number 1. Now the faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Notice how he continues, verse number 2. For by it the people of old received their commendation. Faith is seeing what cannot be seen. It's having certainty in the truthfulness of God and the faithfulness of God, even when it cannot be measured by the standards of man. Verse 2, by faith, by their faithfulness, the people of old received their commendation. So who's an example? You go to Hebrews chapter 11 and think about Moses, or think about Noah. Noah, by faith, he constructed an ark for the saving of his family. Through that ark, he saved the world's animals. Can you imagine asking Noah, Noah, how is it that you were able to show such strength? It was because of the faithfulness of God. It was because of the faithfulness of God to him, and because he knew God was going to keep His word. He was going to keep His promises to destroy the earth with water, and that God would keep His promises to protect His family. What if we talk to Abraham about the command that he was given to go sacrifice Isaac, his precious, special son? How are you able to do that? How are you able to go up the mountain? How are you able to get so close? How are you able to be on the doorstep of making this decision? And Abraham would point us to the faithfulness of God. Listen to how it's worded in Hebrews 11 about Abraham, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. Notice carefully his wording. And he who had received the promises, that's Abraham, was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. So Abraham is described as the one who A, received the promises of God, and B, we're told what those promises were. Your special son Isaac will usher into the world all of these limitless number of peoples in your name, Abraham. He has the spoken promises of God about Isaac. Now he's told to go sacrifice Isaac. How could you make that decision, Abraham? What kind of faith did you possess that allowed you to go make that decision? Well, that's described in the very next verse of Hebrews, chapter 11, verse number 19. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham was so resolute in being willing to sacrifice Isaac, the Hebrews writer says, it's as if he actually sacrificed him. God viewed his faith in that way. So the same God who commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac also said, it's through Isaac all the people that come from you will be born. God will keep his promises no matter what. That was Abraham's thinking. So he thought, it's then on me to keep his commands. His faithfulness was rooted in his understanding of the faithfulness of God. But the next level of this that we noticed was that he is going to show us his favor in lifting up our heads, our horns. He's our shield and protection. Think about two young men who lived in ungodly nations. Joseph and Daniel both lived in the midst of powerful, ungodly kingdoms. And they were blessed, though, with promotions, with prominence among the world's most powerful leaders. God was showing them favor all along so that others would know of their goodness and their responsibility and their trustworthiness. Why were they blessed? Because God wanted to show them his goodness and because they kept trusting God. So God showed his favor upon them. He lifted them up. He was their constant shield even when they were endangered in these kingdoms. You know, we would put a lot of confidence in a rope or a cable that we knew was made from some of the strongest substances available on earth. And then if we knew that that rope was wrapped and coiled in a double braid, maybe around a double core, and yet what we find when it comes to attributes of God, all of his attributes are wound tightly together. They're braided together. We cannot separate one attribute in exclusion from the others. And it's upon his limitless attributes, seen in his regular faithfulness, that we then cling to for strength to support us, for power to lift us up through anything and everything that we face and endure. And that's an important distinction to make moving on in this psalm. We're not going to break down the last section. We just want to mention it as we close, but for the sake of grounding us in truth in all of this and to point us toward Jesus Christ. But the reason the psalmist is writing this psalm is because he has a clear expectation of seeing God's faithfulness. He spent 3/4 of the psalm elevating just how faithful God is. Now listen to how verse 38 begins. But now you have cast off and rejected. The people of God are experiencing something that gives him great concern and discouragement, even about how God is treating them. Two clear options for what event he's describing. We don't know which of these two it might be, but there was a time not too long after the time of David when his son Solomon would die that there became to be a divided kingdom. 10 tribes went one way, the 2 tribes stayed in Judah, and you had kings Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And you can see how the psalmist would experience that moment and think, how can the promise of David's kingdom being this dynasty and continuing, how can that happen if we're now divided? The other possibility is that it was written sometime later, a couple of centuries later, when the Babylonians were coming down against Judah. I lean toward the first one, the divided kingdom era. But the other possibility is that when Babylon came against Judah, right before the final salvo in 586 BC, they took previous king Jehoiakim captive all the way to Babylon. You can see how that would rock the people of God. Our king that's been promised to be a part of this Davidic dynasty always, he's now been kidnapped and carried 1,000 miles to the north. Bring those up because we see how he's focused in on the faithfulness of God and keeping this covenant, and yet there are things or something that has caused him to think, is God really going to come through? More correctly, he's asking, when is God going to come through? There are two things that are mature about this psalmist's response in this section. Number one, he acknowledges that they have not kept their part of the covenant. Remember, we said verses 30 through 37 were key to understanding this last part. God included in the covenant, here's what's happened when you turn your back on me. The psalmist is writing from a place of heartache, a place of crying out, knowing that collectively as God's people, they've missed it. They've turned their back on him, therefore that's why they're suffering. But the second mature thing that he does is that he has difficult questions and he brings them to God. He asks God these questions and he walks through the questions alongside God. Remember verses 15 and 16, walking in the light of your face, turning toward God is the way we begin to access God even in the moments that try us the most. He brings his complaint directly to God, and you'll notice he does so in the context of God's will. I know this is what you've said. I trust in your faithfulness forever. And I just want to see that faithfulness in my lifetime. When we do the very thing the psalmist does, we're turning toward God. And we do so because of our complete trust in him. We don't turn to other sources for answers. And neither do we consider stepping outside of his perfect will and trying to orchestrate things on our own. The tone of this final section is from verse 46. How long, O Lord? How long will you hide yourself forever? The psalmist is directly bringing his concerns and his heartaches to God, asking, when can I see the evidence of what I know to be true about your faithfulness forever? We would do well to learn from his approach. Never believing that God has abandoned us. Never believing that God is not faithful. But when we feel, bringing them to God. And it's because we trust him that we do bring them to him. Who knows what answers this psalmist found out in his lifetime? We don't even know exactly when he lived or what incident he's describing, so we don't know what degree he saw his pleas fulfilled in his lifetime. But what we do know, some millennia removed now, is just how much God has indeed kept the promises he made to David. Through the lens of history, we now know and now see clearly that God kept that Davidic promise to preserve the lineage and the dynasty of David forever. It's because of that promise that we have the King of Kings, Jesus Christ. And the scepter did not depart from David, just as God had promised long ago through the lips of Jacob, that the scepter would not depart from Judah before him. It's in the New Testament that the Hebrews writer in chapter 1 and verse 5, quotes from 2 Samuel chapter 7 and says, I will be a father to him, a father, and he shall be to me a son. He never said that to an angel. But he has said that and does say that to Jesus Christ the Son. Therefore, he has kept his spoken will to never abandon his people, to bring his word to life in the life of Jesus Christ. Jesus himself would teach about his covenant. We're no longer directly under the Davidic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, or any covenant before. We're under the covenant of Jesus, and he would teach that in talking about the communion, the Lord's Supper. For this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. What a great covenant that is. Not defined only by one race or one group of people, but for many. Not for the holding off or the putting off of sin till a future date, but for the complete forgiveness, remission of sins. Then he says, I'm not going to drink this cup again until I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. See the connection between his covenant and his kingdom? When we're living in this time in Jesus Christ, we get to see him as the chosen King of Kings. And we get to enjoy the covenant God has made once and for all, the forever covenant, through which he offers to forgive us and to forgive us through the blood of his Son. If you have not obeyed the words of Jesus, if you've not given your life to him, would you consider them carefully, responsibly this morning? He would say in John 8 and verse 24 that unless you believe in me, you will die in your sins. It's in Matthew chapter 10, verses 32 and 33 that he says, when you acknowledge me before men, I will acknowledge you before my Father, but when you deny me before men, I will deny you before my Father. He would say in Luke chapter 5, verse number 32, I have come to call sinners to repentance. He knows that we've sinned, but he shows us the way out of sin, a complete life change. And that change begins at the waters of baptism, of immersion. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. Mark chapter 16 and verse 16. Jesus tells us exactly how to trust him, to follow him in his faithfulness. If that's a decision that you've not made but that you know you need to make, would you make it now this morning? If you've no longer been living in the light of his face as a Christian, you've not been turned toward him, now's the time to make your life right with him. Please know that we're here for you because God is here for you. Would you come? Come now as we sing.